Lions Nation, full attention. Christmas is here, but there's no room for fantasy, empty promises, or cheap hype. What exists is reality, and Detroit Lions fans deserve to hear the truth exactly as it is. This game carries weight, context, and opportunity. The history of this franchise has always been about facing adversity, adapting and responding when no one believes, and that's exactly where we are right now. The current moment for the Lions demands maximum focus, maturity, and a clear-eyed read of what's in front of this team. It all starts with a radical shift in the situation in Minnesota. The absence of J.J. McCarthy completely changes the tone of this matchup. The script that had been written is torn apart. Instead of the quarterback they prepared for all week, the Lions will face an unlikely name, a reminder that the NFL does not forgive distractions. Max Brosmer, an undrafted free agent, stepping into responsibility at U.S. Bank Stadium. This is not a detail. It's the center of the narrative. Stay until the end, because the analysis here is direct, deep, and unfiltered. Exactly the way Detroit fans deserve it. So smash that like button if you wear Honolulu blue and silver with pride, and drop it in the comments. Go Lions, I believe. Brosmer isn't an unknown, but his track record tells a very specific story. He has appeared in 5 games this season, and his lone start came back on November 30th in Seattle. That night was a disaster for Minnesota's offense. Brosmer threw 4 interceptions, 0 touchdowns, and the Vikings were shut out 26-0. That performance still matters because it's the only full game sample Detroit can study where opposing defenses dictated terms to him for 4 quarters. However, the Vikings believe they saw meaningful growth since then, especially in how Brosmer handled himself after McCarthy went down against the Giants. Last week, Brosmer completed 7 of 9 passes for 52 yards with no turnovers, helping Minnesota secure a win. O'Connell pointed out that one of the biggest differences was how much the Vikings leaned on the run game. Against New York, Minnesota rushed 114 yards. In that Seattle game, they only managed 66 yards on the ground. Brosmer himself admitted that staying on schedule and not forcing throws was the key, and that is exactly the formula Minnesota plans to repeat against Detroit. That brings us to the part Lions fans should be paying close attention to: how the Vikings view Detroit's defense right now. Brosmer described the Lions as a physical front, physical in the box, with athletic players on the outside within the structure of the defense. That's respect, but it also comes with a clear plan. Minnesota wants to keep the ball, avoid long yardage situations, and grind their way down the field. They know Detroit has allowed around 145 rushing yards per game over the last 5 contests, and they see that as an opportunity to protect their quarterback and control tempo. From the Vikings' perspective, this game may not mean much in terms of playoff positioning, but that doesn't mean it's meaningless. O'Connell made it clear they are chasing momentum, trying to finish 2025 with a winning record and potentially close the season on a 5-game win streak. He openly acknowledged what's coming, calling it a massive challenge, emphasizing that Dan Campbell will have Detroit ready, and stressing that this will be 60 minutes of physical NFC North football. That tone tells you Minnesota is not treating this like a throwaway game, even with a backup quarterback under center. Then there's the matchup on the outside. Justin Jefferson was asked directly about Detroit's secondary, which has been dealing with injuries and is missing 3 starters. His response was calm and revealing. He said it doesn't really change anything, pointing out that Detroit's secondary has been banged up late in the season in recent years. Jefferson knows the attention will be on him for most of the game, and he openly embraced that reality, saying it allows other receivers to take advantage of one-on-one matchups. His message was simple: play freely, trust the plan, and go get the football. For Lions fans, all of this should frame how you view this game. Yes, Minnesota is starting an undrafted quarterback. Yes, that quarterback has already shown he can struggle badly when forced into mistakes, but the Vikings are clearly committed to insulating him with the run game, quick decisions, and ball control, while leaning on Jefferson to tilt coverage and open space elsewhere. This is not a team that plans to beat itself. From Detroit's side, the challenge is mental as much as physical. Games like this can become dangerous if focus slips, if tackling isn't sharp, or if early success leads to complacency. Minnesota has nothing to lose. A quarterback eager to prove he belongs, and a star receiver who knows exactly how defenses will play him.
That combination can keep a game uncomfortable if the Lions don't impose their will early and consistently. This is the kind of matchup where preparation, discipline, and execution matter more than names on a depth chart. The Vikings have told us exactly how they want to play this game, and now it's on Detroit to respond on the field. Given everything you've heard about Minnesota's mindset, Brosmer's role, and the way they plan to attack this Lions defense, how do you feel about Detroit's approach heading into this Christmas Day showdown? The Lions' response to all of this will define not just this game, but how this stretch of the season is remembered. When you strip away the storyline of a backup quarterback and focus on the details, what's left is a divisional opponent that wants to drag Detroit into a slow, physical, mistake-free battle. Minnesota knows the formula. Control the run game, shorten possessions, avoid turnovers, and let patience wear the opponent down. That puts even more pressure on Detroit's defensive discipline, especially against the run, where recent numbers show vulnerability. Allowing around 145 rushing yards per game over the last 5 contests is not a coincidence, and it's something the Vikings clearly believe they can exploit to protect Max Brosmer. This is where the Lions' identity has to show up. A physical front only matters if it wins consistently on early downs. If Detroit allows Minnesota to stay in second and manageable and third and short, the Vikings can keep Brosmer comfortable, avoid obvious passing situations, and prevent the Lions from fully unleashing their pressure packages. Brosmer himself said staying on schedule is the recipe, and that should be a red alert for Detroit. Take away first down efficiency, and suddenly the game looks very different. Force him into longer third downs, and the memory of that Seattle start, with 4 interceptions and no touchdowns, becomes much more relevant. Justin Jefferson's comments also tell you exactly what Detroit will face schematically. Minnesota fully expects Jefferson to draw extra attention, and they're comfortable with that. They're counting on Detroit committing resources to number 18, opening space elsewhere. That puts a spotlight on communication in the secondary, on leverage, and on tackling after the catch. Even with injuries and missing starters, Detroit cannot afford busted coverages or hesitation, because that's how an offense with limited explosiveness finds easy yards and confidence. Another layer to this game is Minnesota's motivation. Even without playoff stakes, O'Connell's message was clear. They want to finish strong, build momentum, and prove the growth of this team despite circumstances. That mindset matters. Teams with nothing to lose can be dangerous, especially in divisional games where familiarity breeds intensity. O'Connell openly praised the challenge Detroit presents, highlighting Dan Campbell's preparation and the physical nature of this matchup. That mutual respect means neither side is walking in expecting an easy afternoon. For Lions fans watching this unfold, the key is understanding that this is not about style points. It's about control. Control the line of scrimmage, control early downs, control field position, and control emotion. If Detroit dictates tempo, forces Minnesota out of its comfort zone, and makes Brosmer win the game with his arm under pressure, the advantage swings heavily toward the Lions. But if the Vikings are allowed to execute their plan cleanly, lean on the run, and let Jefferson tilt coverage all game long, this becomes a grind that tests patience until the final whistle. This is the type of game where every missed tackle, every blown assignment, and every stalled drive feels magnified. Christmas Day, divisional football, a backup quarterback trying to prove himself, and a team desperate to finish the year on a high note. All the ingredients are there. Detroit knows what's coming. Minnesota has told the world how they plan to attack. Now it comes down to execution and mindset for 60 minutes. What makes this moment even more revealing for Detroit is how these kinds of games have historically shaped perception around the team. Divisional opponents with backup quarterbacks often become measuring sticks, not because of the opponent's ceiling, but because of how seriously the Lions take the details. Minnesota's plan is simple on paper, but difficult to stop if Detroit loses leverage at the point of attack. A run game that consistently gains 4 or 5 yards forces the defense to tighten, and that's exactly when Jefferson's presence becomes most dangerous, even if he isn't the one catching every pass. His gravity changes spacing, changes timing, and stresses discipline snap after snap. For Detroit, the challenge is resisting the urge to overreact. Overcommitting to Jefferson creates problems elsewhere. Sitting back and playing soft allows Minnesota to stay comfortable and on schedule. The balance is everything. This is where communication and trust inside the defense become critical. Every defender has to win their assignment, because Minnesota is not trying to overwhelm anyone with complexity. They are trying to wait for mistakes, let frustration build, and capitalize when discipline slips. Offensively, Detroit also carries responsibility in shaping this game. Long, efficient drives don't just produce points, they rest the defense and force Minnesota to abandon its ideal script. If the Lions can get out in front early, the Vikings are pushed into a scenario they want to avoid, where Brosmer has to throw more often, take more risks, and operate outside the rhythm they're trying to protect. That's when pressure, disguised looks, and tighter coverage start to matter most. Every 3 and out, every stalled drive on Detroit's side, gives Minnesota life and keeps their plan intact. This is also where leadership shows. Veterans setting the tone, staying locked in when the game slows down, and responding physically when Minnesota tries to impose its will. O'Connell made it clear this is a pride game for the Vikings. They want to prove growth, toughness, and belief, regardless of standings. Detroit has to match that energy without letting emotion turn into mistakes. Divisional games don't require perfection, but they demand consistency. As this matchup unfolds, Lions fans should watch less for explosive highlights and more for small battles being won or lost. First down defense, gap integrity, third down efficiency, red zone execution. These are the quiet indicators that tell you who is actually in control. Minnesota is betting that Detroit's recent struggles against the run give them an opening. Detroit has the chance to close that door by being sharp, physical, and patient for all 4 quarters. As the game reaches its later stages, this is where everything Minnesota is trying to build either holds together or collapses under pressure. If Detroit has done its job early, worn down the run game, and forced longer downs, the Vikings' margin for error becomes razor thin. That's when every decision by Max Brosmer is magnified. A quarterback whose biggest emphasis has been don't do too much suddenly has to make plays against tighter windows, louder noise, and a defense that knows exactly what's coming. That shift doesn't happen by accident. It's created through discipline, patience, and consistent execution from the opening drive onward. Detroit also has to understand the psychological side of this matchup. Minnesota is playing free. They're not carrying playoff pressure, but they are carrying pride. Every successful drive, every conversion on third down reinforces their belief that the plan is working. That belief can keep a team competitive longer than talent alone ever could. On the other hand, if Detroit forces early mistakes, shuts down the run, and limits Jefferson's impact without overcommitting, doubt creeps in quickly. That's when the Vikings are forced to abandon balance, and the game tilts sharply. This is why Lions fans should be locked in on the body language, the response after adversity, and the way Detroit handles momentum swings. Divisional games are rarely clean. Something will go wrong at some point. The difference is how quickly the team resets and reasserts control. Minnesota has already told us they expect this to be physical, that they expect 60 minutes of hard football, and that they're putting everything they have into this game. Detroit has to meet that standard snap after snap, not just in flashes. When it's all said and done, this matchup will say a lot about where the Lions are right now. Not in headlines, not in narratives, but in substance. Can they dictate terms against a team determined to slow the game down? Can they stay disciplined against a plan designed to test patience? Can they turn a favorable situation on paper into a decisive performance on the field? Those are the questions that matter far more than who starts at quarterback for Minnesota. One more layer that can't be ignored is how these final minutes of a divisional game often come down to situational football. Minnesota's entire approach is built around limiting situations where Brosmer has to improvise. 2-minute drills, third and long late in halves, red zone snaps where space tightens, those are the moments Detroit must force. If the Lions can consistently win early downs, those high-leverage situations stack up quickly. And when they do, the pressure shifts entirely onto a quarterback who is still proving he can handle it when the structure breaks down. From Minnesota's point of view, everything circles back to staying calm. Brosmer talked about not trying to do too much, about taking what the defense gives him and moving the ball piece by piece. That sounds simple, but late in games, when the clock, the crowd, and the scoreboard all start working against you, simplicity becomes harder to maintain. Detroit's job is to accelerate that stress without losing its own composure. Missed tackles or penalties at that stage undo all the good work that comes before it. This is also where Detroit's physicality has to translate into finishing power. It's one thing to slow the run early. It's another to stop it when everyone in the stadium knows it's coming. Minnesota wants to prove it can still line up and move the ball when the defense is expecting it. That's the pride element O'Connell talked about. For Detroit, matching that moment means winning one-on-one battles, setting the edge, and making tackles that send a message as much as they stop the clock. As the fourth quarter unfolds, attention will inevitably return to Justin Jefferson. Even if his stat line isn't explosive, his influence doesn't disappear. The Lions must stay disciplined, trusting their coverage rules and not chasing plays that aren't there. Overreaction is exactly what Minnesota hopes for. Staying steady, forcing throws underneath, and rallying to the ball keeps the Vikings ceiling low and shrinks the field drive by drive. By the final whistle, this game will be less about surprises and more about execution. Minnesota has shown its hand. Detroit knows the plan. There are no hidden elements here, only the question of who carries it out better under pressure. That's why this matchup matters, not just as a win or loss, but as a reflection of how the Lions handle games they are expected to control. At this point, everything circles back to trust. Trust in preparation, trust in assignments, and trust that patience will eventually break resistance. Minnesota's approach only works if Detroit helps it work. Missed fits, late reactions, or mental lapses are the oxygen that keeps an underdog competitive. The Lions' task is not to chase the knockout punch too early, but to keep applying pressure until cracks appear naturally. That's how games like this are supposed to end when the favorite stays disciplined. There's also an important emotional dynamic here that fans shouldn't overlook. Minnesota is playing with a chip on its shoulder, an undrafted quarterback starting on a national stage, a team written off in the standings, and a divisional opponent expected to handle business. That combination can fuel effort and focus. Detroit has to counter that with professionalism, not emotion, not frustration, just steady execution. Every snap handled the same way, whether it's the first drive or the last. If the Lions stay clean, the game gradually becomes smaller for the Vikings. Fewer options, tighter windows, more responsibility on Brosmer to make throws he's been told all week not to force. That's the trap Minnesota is trying to avoid, and it's exactly the situation Detroit should be working to create. Defensive stops turn into offensive opportunities. Field position flips, and suddenly the Vikings' margin disappears. What ultimately decides this matchup won't be one play, but accumulation. Hits adding up, short gains turning into stalled drives, confidence slowly shifting from one sideline to the other. Detroit doesn't need perfection, but it does need consistency. This is the type of game that rewards teams who respect the opponent enough to play sharp football from start to finish. As Lions fans, this is where you judge the team not by noise, but by control. How they handle expectations, how they respond when Minnesota punches back, and whether they can turn a clear plan into a clear result. When you look at the bigger picture, this matchup is really about whether Detroit can turn awareness into action. Everyone knows what Minnesota wants to do. They've said it openly. Run the ball, stay on schedule, protect Brosmer, and let Jefferson's presence manipulate coverage. None of that is hidden. The difference between a controlled win and an unnecessarily tight game